Welcome back. We continue our coverage now of the developing situation between Russia and Ukraine. Turning to our panel, I'm joined this hour by Dmitry Babich, political analyst for Sputnik Radio, and Daniel Lazare. He's a journalist and author of The Frozen Republic, How the Constitution Is Paralyzing Democracy. Dmitry, let's start with you. Can you just share for us what exactly the feeling is in Moscow following these events? Do people have a sense that things are calm for now, that it's gone quite as far as it can at this point?
Well, people are, of course, concerned, but not so much as in Ukraine. In Ukraine, it's going to be a scandal because President Poroshenko announced a martial law that will last until January 28th. Let me remind you that Ukraine is going to have an election in March, the presidential election. So a lot of people in Russia and, of course, in Ukraine hoped that there would be a chance to replace him because Poroshenko is extremely unpopular in Ukraine and even more unpopular in Russia. So now that the martial law is imposed, Poroshenko will have a chance to postpone the elections or make the presidential campaign be conducted in such a way that he will be able to win the election, even though right now his approval rating is about 8%, and his anti-rating is huge. It's about 70%. Some surveys show even 80%.
Wow.
So he would have a formidable opponent in the person of Yulia Tymoshenko, the former prime minister, who also has a huge anti-rating, but who is still more popular than President Poroshenko because she has about 18% of support. Now, her chances are questionable because of the martial law.
And Daniel, Presidents Putin and Trump are supposed to meet later this week during the G20 summit in Buenos Aires. How will this incident impact their discussions?
Well, Trump will be under great pressure to get tough with Putin, to show that the U.S. Is opposed to these maneuvers in the Kerch Strait. But the question is whether Trump will push back. Trump does not give the Ukraine a very high priority. So the question is whether he'll be pushed or he'll push.
And what do you sense he'll do, considering his record on this issue? I mean, he opted to, for example, provide the Ukrainian military with lethal weapons, something even the Obama administration refused to do.
Yeah, well, Trump is unpredictable, but you're right. I mean, Trump, when all is said and done, has actually wound up being more aggressive than the Obama administration. So therefore, I guess if you had to bet money, I would bet on a tough response rather than a more measured response.
And Dmitry, you touched on this a bit already, but can you expand on what's driving Ukrainian President Poroshenko's unpopularity at the moment, and what exactly is driving this move to replace him next year?
Well, the problem is that the standard of living has fallen dramatically in Ukraine after the Maidan putsch in 2014. Let me tell our viewers, for example, that the trade with the European Union, which the whole Maidan thing was initially all about, this association agreement and free trade with the EU. Now the trade is lesser than in the times of President Yanukovych, who was ousted as a result of the protests, which the mainstream media in the West calls peaceful, but which actually killed 38 policemen. So Poroshenko he has been losing popularity for quite some time now. For example, his money was uncovered in Panama in this Fonseca fund. They were looking for Putin's money there. They didn't find Putin's money, but they found Poroshenko's money there. And there was a huge scandal which he tried to cover up, using his control over the media and his power over the president of a country at war. Poroshenko loves to stress that Ukraine is at war with Russia. This is the language that Russia tries to avoid. But for Poroshenko, it's indispensable because this is the only way for him to stay in power, to say that we are so much threatened by Russia, that we need martial law, we need limitations on presidential campaigning, and we need full authority in my hands. Right now, Poroshenko is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and he is in charge, fully in charge or the so-called operation in the east of Ukraine, where he is fighting the two self-proclaimed republics which just refused to accept the ousting of the former president Viktor Yanukovych in 2014. So for Poroshenko, it's a make-or-break situation. He faces huge risks if he loses power, because he may be pursued for corruption. His buddies may lose their money and their power. So he will do everything he can to stay in charge. And the only way to stay in charge is to have a dramatic deterioration of relations with Russia.
Daniel, the NATO-backed think tank, the Atlantic Council, published a piece saying NATO and the United States should send in naval ships in the Sea of Azov to guarantee that it stays open to international shipping. What is your response to this?
Well, it's a classic maneuver by the Atlantic Council, which is funded by the Saudis and by the Ukrainian diaspora. They're always looking for war. They're a neocon outfit, which is always looking for confrontation and war, and they're seeking it in this venue. They're trying to take this confrontation and enlarge it.
And how dangerous is that?
Very dangerous, very dangerous. My only hope is that that Trump will have the good sense to say no, but it's impossible to say. I mean, Trump is surrounded by neocons, and so he often finds himself giving in to them.
Dmitry, in the about 30 seconds we have left, anything you want to add to that?
Well, I would like to add that the only good thing about Trump is that he has a bad relationship with the European Union. If Hillary Clinton had been in charge, there would be a united coalition against Russia, as aggressive as Mr. Trump now, but also supported by the European powers. So that's all I have to add.
Very difficult to imagine a more intense scenario, but we hope things stay calm for now. Daniel Lazare, Dmitry Babich, thanks so much.
Thank you.
With Russia and Ukraine in question, we're joined now by George Galloway, former UK MP. George, you said on Twitter, as all of this unfolded, that you've, quote, warned everyone Ukraine will drag our idiot leaders and thereby us into a potentially cataclysmic war with Russia. Why has that been a concern for you?
Well, it's the front line, and it's the obvious tripwire. This was a studied and dangerous provocation. The only question is, and I'm not yet sure of the answer, is whether the NATO dog wagged the Ukrainian tail or whether the Ukrainian tail wagged the dog. The only question is this a Poroshenko maneuver to rescue his fading fortunes, both in national terms but also electoral terms? March is coming up fast. He's miles behind his nearest rival in the presidential polls. It could be a wag the dog maneuver by him to declare martial law, interrupt the elections, maybe even postpone or abandon them altogether. Or it could be something more sinister even than that, which is the beginning of an attempt to militarily engage NATO with the forces of the Russian Federation. And if that's the case, we're looking at the second Crimea war, which will definitely be the last one.
It's a terrifying scenario you've laid out there. What is your reaction to the UN Security Council opting to block Russia's initiative to discuss this incident as a Ukrainian violation of international law?
It seems like every day the United Nations mechanisms, and including the Security Council, are determined to demonstrate their own inadequacy, their own increasing irrelevancy. How anyone could refuse to discuss what is quite plainly and captured on film, the vessels of one state sailing through the waters of another state without permission, when the whole place is already a war zone. How anyone could decide not to discuss that on that basis is patently ridiculous. It's utterly illogical. It's flying in the face of the facts. As I say, the only issue here is whether Poroshenko has done this for his own personal reasons or whether NATO has told him to do it.
How are citizens in the UK reacting to this news, and how is the media reporting on it?
Well, I think it's some nervousness. because this is the front line. If all-out hostilities begin between Russia and the Ukraine has already called on its friends in NATO to come to the aid of the beleaguered government in Kiev, beggared by the recklessness of their own coup leaders. I think people can see that this could be World War III. We thought it might start in Syria. Maybe it'll start on the Russia-Ukraine border, or maybe even both. Look out for provocations in Syria in these tense hours.
How do you expect the international community to react in the coming hours, and how should they, if you were up there leading in any way?
Well, you'd have to try and take the heat out of this. You would have to agree at the Security Council that Ukraine should not have done this, and that steps, mechanisms need to be put in place to avoid any replication of these events. But the way the Security Council has handled it thus far, it doesn't seem to indicate they want to take the heat out of the situation. As I've just written in a piece on RT.com, anybody who thinks that these endless slaps in the face that are being dealt to Russia, endless sanctions, provocations, insults, false accusations, can go on forever without the Russians responding, is living in a fool's paradise. You know, Russia is not the Russia of the first Crimea War. Russia is a thermonuclear armed, multiply nuclear armed world power. And you just can't treat such a power like this.
I want to turn to Moscow now, because we can turn to Mark Sleboda. He is in Moscow for us. And I want to ask you, Mark, exactly. Russia says Ukraine performed a dangerous maneuver, while the Ukrainian Navy claims Russia rammed its tugboat. In that footage we watched, the two parties also contradict each other on whether or not the Ukrainian Navy followed proper procedure when passing through the strait. What's your read on this game of Moscow says, Kiev says, and why would either party risk a military escalation at this stage?
Okay, well, first of all, you might ask the question of why a tugboat is accompanying two Ukrainian Navy gunboats, and that's in case one of them breaks down to tow it away. If you watch the footage, it's quite obvious that the Russian ship, the officers in charge yelling back, are trying to avoid this tugboat, which is veering back and forth, seemingly deliberately trying to present itself in the path of the Russian ship. As for the proper procedure involved for passing the Kerch Straits, Ukrainian military and commercial vessels have passed through the Kerch Straits from the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea back and forth again and again, nearly daily for the last 4 years, without any problems, because they followed the terms of a 2000 treaty governing passage of the Kerch Straits, signed by the then presidents of Russia and Ukraine, which Ukraine is a party to. They've always followed that protocol up until yesterday, something that the Western mainstream media won't tell you. By the terms of the treaty, any ship passing through the Sea of Azov, through the Kerch Straits into the Sea of Azov, is required to contact the Kerch port authorities, report who they are, what their destination is, what their cargo is, receive navigation instructions, and so on. It's a very shallow sea. It's only 20-some feet in depth. It's a very dangerous passageway, made even more complicated by the Crimean bridge connecting Crimea to Kerch that Russia has recently built. That is a primary security concern for Russia, a legitimate security concern, considering that repeatedly Ukrainian politicians and officials in the Maidan Putsch regime have called for the destruction of the bridge. So Russia had every reason to demand that Ukraine follow the protocols. They did not. This is a deliberate provocation for domestic political reasons in Ukraine that Russia responded to with legitimate use of force and I would say even mild.
And we're unfortunately out of time, but we'll leave it there for now. We thank our panelists, former UK MP George Galloway and Mark Sleboda, an international affairs analyst.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.